Welcome back to another episode of Podcast on the Brink. William McDermott of Inside the Hall and of WIUX. Don't want to forget William's great work on the IU student radio broadcast. He does a terrific job there. Is back on Podcast on the Brink. William, much better circumstances that we're talking about this team under than we did last time you were on the show.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to believe the turnaround in just 2 weeks that this team has been able to make. I know after the Penn State game, I think I wrote a pretty critical article just kind of like the attitude surrounding the program. And I think you could kind of tell with, the players just weren't really all there. And then all of a sudden, they come home for that Wisconsin game and, it's like a switch was flipped on the defensive end and everything has kind of followed with that. I mean, in the last 4 games, they're holding teams to an average of like around 64 points a game. So they just whatever they've done, it's really worked on the defensive end. And I think that's kind of been the telltale sign of how the past 2 weeks have gone. Four wins in a row for Indiana. So not much to complain about.
What's been most surprising for you about this turnaround? Is it just the fact that Indiana has kind of won these games in different ways? Is it the fact that they've won all 4? It kind of seemed like once they were on the losing streak, it had a chance to really snowball and the season could have really spiraled downward. I'm just curious what maybe out of the stretch has been most surprising for you.
I think you have to tab their resiliency. I mean, three of the 4 teams they beat, excluding Minnesota, those are 3. If, the tournament was tomorrow, those are 3 teams that would probably make the tournament. I know Wisconsin is kind of on the bubble right now, but, they were convincing wins. I mean, they all were about by 13 or more points over teams that going into the game, it was expected to be a close game. I know for Illinois, a lot of people went into that, myself, and I'm sure you did included, thinking they were going to lose. They've been terrible on the road in Big Ten play under Mike Woodson, and they've won 2 road Big Ten games in a row. I'm sure we'll get into the Minnesota game later, but I think just their resiliency, the ability for them to come back. I mean, I think just after the Penn State game, I had no hope for any of how the rest of the season would go. And you have to credit the players, but I think you also have to give a lot of credit to Mike Woodson and the job he's done in getting this team turned around and still focused, because you still got a whole lot of season left. I mean, we're only about halfway through.
You mentioned that Illinois game. You were there, obviously. For those who don't know, the student radio broadcasters in Illinois basically get to sit at the top of the arena. I don't know. I've been up there before a couple of times, William. I don't know exactly how you call a game on radio from up there. So kudos to you for being able to do that. What was that atmosphere like? Because that game, in many ways, it kind of felt like Illinois had built it up going in as their Super Bowl, basically. They had all this stuff on social media. The Orange Crush seemed to be very riled up for the game. And Illinois, it seemed like an electric atmosphere, but Indiana basically seemed to take the crowd of it. What was it like just being there and in the arena, and what could you feel the energy in the building shifting as the game moved along?
I just remember Illinois went up 4-0 early. Indiana turned the ball over like 3 or 4 times in the first couple minutes of the game. Mike Woodson calls that timeout, and I think that might be a season-defining timeout. It really changed the whole game. I think you could tell right off tip Indiana wasn't settled in. They were a little rattled by the environment. It was pretty loud in there in the first half. And then Mike Woodson calls the timeout, draws up a couple plays, tells them to tighten up defensively. And from there, it was all Indiana. They never really looked back. And I mean, Alex, fans were heading for the exits with 10 minutes left in the second half. And after Indiana kind of withstanded that Illinois push to start the second half, it was over. There was no chance. And I think, there's a lot of questions about how Brad Underwood went about his game plan in guarding Trayce Jackson-Davis. And I think, looking back on that, I'm sure that's one he wishes he had back, but you have to credit Indiana on the road against, a top 25 caliber team in Illinois. I mean, they whooped their butt. So you got to credit Mike Woodson for that turnaround and that timeout. But the atmosphere was great. I mean, the spaceship, I went there last year for a women's game and there was like no one there. So to see it kind of full was pretty cool. I guess I just didn't really get to experience how loud it probably could have been just because of a dominant game it was for Indiana.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about Trayce Jackson-Davis because you mentioned him and Brad Underwood's decision not to double team him in that game. But we've seen now for a significant stretch now in Big Ten play, Big Ten teams trying different ways to try to stop Trayce Jackson-Davis. And ultimately, it really hasn't mattered because you look at what he did the other night against Minnesota. I know they were shorthanded, but they played a zone and he still found a way to get his numbers that he's been getting. You've watched a ton of college basketball. You watched North Carolina growing up and you've watched a lot of Big Ten basketball. This stretch that we're seeing right now from Trayce Jackson-Davis, to me, I've been covering IU basketball since the 2007-8 season. So that was Eric Gordon's lone season in Bloomington. This is as dominant of an individual stretch as I can remember from an IU basketball player. Just kind of your thoughts on how Trayce is playing right now and maybe how that compares to some of the other runs that you've seen in recent history from some of the greats in college basketball.
Well, first person I think of when I think of kind of the run that Trayce Jackson-Davis has been on is Bryce Johnson's 2016 year for North Carolina. I mean, he was a guy who he came in as a freshman, skinny, super athletic. He didn't have any post moves. He was basically a rim protector, could run the floor and dunk. That's kind of what Roy Williams used him as. And over the course of his college career, he really developed himself into a guy that could not only was one of the best rim protectors in the ACC and best defenders in the ACC, but also one of the best offensive players in the ACC. He had a game against Florida State that I'll always remember. It was in Tallahassee where he scored 30 points and had 25 rebounds. It was ridiculous. I mean, just all over the floor. And that's kind of what Trayce Jackson-Davis is doing is what Bryce Johnson did that season for North Carolina, because he really put that team on his back, especially when Marcus Page was injured for a lot of the beginning of the season that year. They really needed him to step up. I remember he was huge in an ACC Big Ten Challenge game over Melo Trimble and Maryland. That's kind of what I would compare it to. And obviously that's kind of biased because I grew up watching Carolina, but what he's been able to do is it's a nightly basis of him getting, 20 and 10 over the past few games, and you can almost guarantee it. And I think you might circle that Iowa game in particular as one where he really put his foot in the ground and put the team on his back. And, I wouldn't be surprised if this is something, with Xavier Johnson still injured and obviously the injury to Race Thompson, where Mike Woodson said to him, you need to be trying to score on every possession. We need you, because without you getting 20 and 10, we're not going to win with, the roster we're putting out on the court right now. And I think he's taken that into his own, and he's catapulted himself into right now probably the second best player in the Big Ten. I think he's got to be right up there in Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year as well.
If you're an opposing Big Ten team, and just kind of based on the body of evidence of what you've seen and the different ways that people have tried to slow him down, what would your approach be to try to neutralize him? And do you think as the season here goes along, we're going to see different wrinkles from different coaches that maybe from teams that Indiana hasn't played to try to slow him down? But like I said, it doesn't really necessarily seem like anything that anybody's trying has been all that effective. He just seems to be playing at a totally different level than anybody else on the court. I mean, he's been the best player on the floor now for several games in a row. I'll be interested to see if that continues to be the case coming up against Zach Edey, but it's just been ridiculous how dominant he's been when you look at the numbers.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Minnesota tried to do with the zone is kind of what a lot of teams are going to resort to. Tom Izzo gave them a lot of different looks in the Michigan State game. The only thing about that is Indiana's perimeter players made shots. I mean, when he passed out of the double teams and was far away from the basket and they hedged to help, like Tamar Bates and Trey Galloway just made shots. And there's nothing really Michigan State could do about that. So if those guys are doing that, Indiana's a tough team to beat. I mean, especially they're dangerous offensively. I think, one of the most dangerous teams in the country if they can just get some guys to make some shots. I think what we saw against Minnesota in the zone is basically the opposite of that. They forced the ball out of Trayce Jackson-Davis's hands as much as they could. And Indiana's perimeter players, Trey Galloway, Tamar Bates, they just didn't make shots. There were multiple wide open looks they had, and Jalen Hood-Schifino had a lot as well that just wouldn't fall. You're not going to be able to hold TJD under 15 and 10. That's unreasonable at this point. He's going to get the offensive rebounds. He's going to get the transition dunks. He's going to run the floor well. I think you just got to get the ball out of his hands as much as possible, because when you let him make plays, and we've seen how good he has improved as a passer this season, and guys are making shots, Indiana offensively is really dangerous.
Yeah, the question I have moving forward is, are enough guys going to be able to make perimeter shots consistently? We saw it against Michigan State. We saw kind of the opposite against Minnesota. Miller Copp made some, but overall Indiana really struggled from the perimeter. One guy I want to talk about in particular, this has really been hard for me to figure out what maybe his trajectory is, Tamar Bates. All right. Over the last 4 games against Michigan State, he has 17 points. The other 3 games, Indiana all wins against Wisconsin, Illinois, Minnesota. He didn't score a point in any of those games. It's really hard to kind of figure out maybe what makes Tamar Bates tick on a game-to-game basis, because a player that talented, a player that good of a shooter, to me, shouldn't be having games where he's, scoreless regularly. I mean, to me, he should be a guy whose floor coming off the bench should be 6 to 8 points, providing instant offense. What have you seen out of him just in this last stretch? Obviously, he showed that he could be great against Michigan State, but then to have 3 games where he goes scoreless, it kind of makes it hard for Mike Woodson and the coaching staff to trust him on a game-to-game basis and know what they're going to get out of him.
Well, with Tamar, I think he's still at a little bit of an immature level in terms of his play. I think he's a good spot-up shooter. I mean, we've seen off the catch and shoot, he's shooting at a high clip, about 40%. It's just he can't really create for himself offensively. He can't get to the rim. I don't think he has the strength. I think that's something he's really going to have to work on in the offseason, just building that strength with the ball, being able to get to the rim, and so he can score at all 3 levels. Another thing, I mean, his shot selection, Alex, is bad. Some of the shots he takes, even in that Michigan State game, he took about 3 threes that were like from the logo 35 feet out. And it's like 2 of them went in, right? But it's like, man, if he's not making these, Mike Woodson's not going to have Tamar Bates in the game much. So I think for him, he's really got to establish some strength. One thing I really don't understand is why you struggle so much on the defensive end. I think the strength is an issue with that, but he's quick. I mean, I think he has quick feet. He just, a lot of the time, he seems a step slow. And in that Minnesota game, he was terrible defensively. There were multiple times he got beat backdoor, committed bad fouls, things like that. So I think for him, it's really just establishing his strength, becoming a physical player. I think he's streaky right now. He's long and lanky. I think if he puts some muscle on and puts more weight on, it'll be easier for him to get to the basket. I think one thing I wish he could do more of is get to the free throw line. I mean, he doesn't really get to the foul line at all. And he, with how good of a shooter he is, if he can get to the foul line, it's almost guaranteed free throws. So that's something moving forward in his college career I think he could do. And he still has time to figure it out. He's only a sophomore, but I think he's a little bit behind where people thought he would be at this point.
Yeah, one of the plays that really stood out to me against Minnesota, there was a play where he got beat. I think it was like a backdoor cut by Will Ramberg, who I think was a walk-on at one point and played 4 minutes, scored 4 points, but not only got beat, he gave up a layup and he fouled him. And it's like that's just a play that you can't have happening. Even against a good player, you can't get beat like that. And to have it against a guy who really hasn't even been a factor all season for Minnesota or played, just kind of one of those mistakes that you look at and say, if you're not going to be locked in more than that defensively, you can't play. So that to me was a play that really stood out. One thing I want to just ask you about is this rotation at the 4 at this point. Obviously, Trayce Thompson started the Minnesota game. I get that because it's, his 6th year now at Indiana. Last game, he's going to get a chance to play at Williams Arena. Obviously, his dad played football for the Gophers and well known there and had a ton of family and friends. I get starting him. The strange thing to me about it was he barely, he started but didn't play a ton of minutes in the first half. They went to Malik Renew, who scored, I think, 10 points in the first half, played a little bit of Jordan Geronimo, who I believe had 2 turnovers and 2 fouls pretty quickly. Didn't look particularly great, but obviously going from starting back to being on the bench maybe changes his rhythm going into a game. But just this rotation now, not specifically the Minnesota game, although you can talk about that a little bit if you want. I'm sure you have some thoughts on how that was handled, but how does this kind of shake out now moving forward? Nothing against Trayce Thompson, but I almost feel like sometimes when he and TJD are out there together, Trayce can clog the paint up a little bit and make it a little bit harder for TJD to operate. And I almost like sometimes the movement that Jordan Geronimo gives away from the ball and being able to kind of slip past defenders and get easy looks at the rim for passes from TJD. I almost like that a little bit more at times than what Trayce provides. And obviously Malik Renew played well in the first half, and then we barely saw him the second half. So it feels like this is going to kind of be like a by committee approach depending on the game. But I just wonder if Indiana needs to get this a little bit more settled here as we enter February and the schedule toughens up and figure out just a way how they're going to deploy these guys, because it seems like they have a lot of different options, and I don't necessarily think it was handled optimally in the Minnesota game.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely wasn't, Alex. I mean, I don't want to get on Coach Yaw and stuff for the job he did. I mean, he found out, like, I think the day of the game that he was going to be, bleeding. I guess I don't even want to say like acting head coach, because that's not really what they called it. Yeah, he just had the scout for the game, so he was the one who did media and stuff or something. But Coach Kenya Hunter and Brian Walsh, apparently they were in charge of the substitutions. I don't know. It was really weird. I don't really quite understand what the thought process behind that was. I don't know why you wouldn't just have like one guy just do everything. So that was kind of weird to me, but that's a whole other discussion. When it comes to Jordan Geronimo, I think when he initially came into the lineup for Trayce Thompson, we kind of saw it, like in that Iowa game, he kind of tried to play like Trayce and not himself. And through the Illinois and Wisconsin game, we kind of saw Jordan Geronimo be Jordan Geronimo. And I think that's kind of what you hit on, just his off-ball movement. He could stretch the floor. We see him shoot that mid-range a little bit, charge the offensive glass. That's what he's best at, that offensive glass and getting rebounds, blocking shots, and rim protecting on the defensive end. I don't know. Trayce is a tough, a 6-year guy. He has the experience. He's going to be steady and consistent, I think, when he's fully healthy. I still don't think he's at 100%. I think that was clear in the Minnesota game. It's kind of a good problem to have. I agree in saying I think Trayce Jackson-Davis has a little bit more freedom when Geronimo is on the floor, but I also think Malik Renew is really good on the weak side. I think you saw that in the first half against Minnesota. And I have no idea why Malik Renew did not play that much in the second half. I mean, he went 4 for 5, 10 points. I think it was his first double-digit game since November. And he didn't even play. He played less than a minute in the second half. And Coach Yas said it was something about matchups. I think they wanted Race to guard Battle, even though Battle had like 20 points or something. So I don't really understand that. But I think, when Race gets back to 100%, I think things will start to come to form again. And once he gets more comfortable out there and spreading the floor, kind of like he did early on in the season, you're not going to ask Race to play weak side like Renault or, get on the offensive glass like Geronimo can. But if he plays his role, can spread the floor, play good defense, you're going to have to put him on the court just because of his experience.
Yeah, the only thing I can think of for that second half is they wanted to ride with kind of a consistent lineup and try to get go with the guys that are most experienced maybe in that spot, because you got Race and Trayce in a road game. They've been in that situation many times, and maybe they just felt more comfortable going with the upperclassmen. Same thing, Miller Copp doesn't even come out of the game. He plays all 40 minutes. Probably a big reason for that is, he's an experienced guy, and you trust him maybe to not make mistakes more than you do a Tamar Bates or a CJ Gunn at this juncture of the season. So they tightened it up in the second half, and it fortunately for Indiana, it worked out. Miller Kopp is a guy that has been, I feel like at times unfairly discussed by IU fans because they wonder just kind of what he does on a game-to-game basis. He doesn't score a lot, obviously. When he does get open shots, he typically makes them, as evidenced by his three-point percentage. And it was interesting. Mike Woodson, I think, was asked about getting more shots for him in a press conference in the last couple of weeks, and he kind of basically said he didn't. I don't necessarily think he answered the question, but it doesn't sound like it's like something they're going to change in terms of like, hey, let's run like 2 or 3 sets a half for Miller Kopp. So he's going to just kind of get what he gets in terms of, hiding in the corner and trying to get a 3-point attempt or getting a transition 3, and that's kind of the role he's had. I thought you wrote a really good piece about just his performance in Minnesota, how important it was on a night where Jalen Hood-Schifino shoots 2 for 11, Trey Galloway 1 for 5. Tamar Bates obviously didn't contribute much. It was Miller Kopp that ultimately was kind of that second guy offensively for Indiana, as hard as it was to believe based on just kind of his numbers this season. I think it was the first time he'd scored in double figures since the Elon game. That kind of speaks to just kind of how low usage Miller Kopp is offensively.
Yeah, he's a really interesting player. I think, and you kind of hit the hammer on the nail. I don't really understand a lot of the criticism that Miller Kopp gets. I think a lot of people are like, oh, well, he just stands in the corner. What does he do? Like, he doesn't do anything. He's posting zeros on the box score. That's his role. Like, it's not, he's not going to shoot 7 threes every game like he did against Minnesota. That's just not going to happen. That's just what had to happen in order for Indiana to beat Minnesota. Without him knocking a couple of those threes down and getting that loose ball to start the game, they probably wouldn't have won. So it's like there are going to be nights where they need him to make more shots. And then there are going to be games like the Michigan State game where Tamar Bates kind of fills that role. And he does more. He plays scrappy defense, plays tough, doesn't really. Miller Kopp's not a guy you look at and you're like, oh my gosh, what an idiotic mistake. He doesn't really make those head scratching plays a lot of the time. And I think you hit that a little bit earlier of why he played the full 40 minutes. He's a guy I think the coaching staff trusts. He's not going to commit a silly foul, and he's not going to, leave an assignment wide open defensively or make a mental mistake. And he talked about this last week. And when I wrote the article after the Minnesota game, I went back and rewatched that press conference. And I thought he had a really good answer on just kind of how he's comfortable in his role. He knows his role. His job is not to score 20 points a game. It's not to score 10 points a game like it was at Northwestern. His job is to play tough defensively, be vocal defensively, shoot when he's open because he can make it, not turn the ball over, not make mistakes. He's never going to be the focal point of the offense. And I think fans kind of look at him and say, oh, well, he's shooting 45% from three. Clearly he needs to shoot the ball more. But that's not the player he is. He's not going to be pulling up from three in transition. He's not going to be, coming off drag screens and end arounds with a quick release shot. That's just not how he plays. And I think once people kind of start to realize that, maybe the criticism will dissipate. But a lot of it is kind of unwarranted. I mean, I don't know. Every conversation that I've had with Miller, it's been great. I had a phone call with him. We talked for like 15, 20 minutes about Pete Nance before the North Carolina game. And I think, if you follow him on social media, he's all over it and stuff. I think he's a good teammate. I think he's a good leader. And I think fans just need to kind of understand that there are going to be games where he doesn't do anything that because it just wasn't in the game plan. But then there are going to be games where, you say, I'm glad this guy's on this team.
Yeah. Full disclosure. I was one of those tweets at one point. I think there was a game where he played like 11 minutes in the first half and had all zeros.
We all kind of were. I'm guilty of it as well. Sometimes I kind of wish he was a little bit more active in shooting the ball. I think he hesitates a little bit, but I think his transition from last year to this year is really in his comfortability. I don't think he was comfortable last year. I think he was still trying to kind of figure out who he was at Indiana, what he wanted to be, how he wanted to play. And this year, I think he's really figured that out.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I would say, when you have a guy shooting that high of a percentage, at least run something occasionally to try to get him a shot. I mean, it's a pretty high, especially if teams start doing more to try to take Jackson-Davis away as they're going to. I look at this roster and, if you can run something to get Miller Copp a shot occasionally, to me, that's better than a contested two from Jalen Hood-Schifino in transition or some of these shots that Tamar Bates has taken. That would be but that's not Miller Copp. That's not on Miller Copp. That's on, whatever Indiana's trying to do offensively.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, Indiana's won 4 straight. Obviously, it's been kind of a shift in terms of the fan base and what they're thinking about this team. It really Indiana basketball, and William, I'm sure you're kind of realizing this now that you're covering the team for a second year. Everything's on a game by game basis with this program. It's you're only as good as your last game. It can go from losing 3 straight to all of a sudden now you're winning 4 in a row and things are on top of the world. I'm sure if Indiana loses a couple games here soon, which they're probably going to at some point, it's gonna be skies falling again. Where are you at with just this team and what it can ultimately achieve this season? Have you kind of bought back into some of the preseason expectations when you kind of look at what they've done recently? Obviously, I don't know that they're going to be able to get maybe the seed that a lot of people thought in the preseason and the NCAA tournament, but I also wonder that how important that is this season. It seems to be pretty wide open in college basketball. Feels like a year where you just need to make the tournament and then see what happens more than what you're seeded. I still feel like there's a lot left out there for this group. If they can continue to play well defensively like they have in the last 4 games, and maybe you get Xavier Johnson back at some point and have a chance to go on a run.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the big question of when he's going to come back. In terms of expectations, I think they're a little bit, with the injuries and whatnot, you got to cut them a little bit of slack. But I think they're about where people thought they were going to be at this point in the season. I mean, if before the year you told a fan that Indiana was going to beat Xavier, North Carolina, Illinois, Michigan State, before February, and they were only going to have 6 losses, I think a lot of people would say, oh, I mean, that might sound about right for where they would be. So there's a lot of ball left to play. There's a lot of ball left to play. And I think with the upcoming schedule, there's a lot of winnable games on that too. And aside from Purdue and the Big Ten, it's really wide open right now. There's not really, it's kind of Purdue. And then there's a big chunk of maybe 6-7 teams in the middle that are kind of, around 5-4, 5-3 in Big Ten play. And then obviously the bottom feeders. But, I don't know. I think this team is in a good spot. I think come March, if they get Xavier Johnson back and they kind of find a groove, and Trayce Jackson-Davis, if he's still playing at this high of a level, National Player of the Year candidate, Big Ten Player of the Year candidate, they're going to be a dangerous team. But once again, I really think it comes down to the guard play. I think if Trey Galloway and Tamar Bates have to be consistent if this team really wants to win a Big Ten title, Big Ten tournament title, or even a national title. That's going to be the X factor. It's not going to be is X going to come back, because they've proven they can win without him. So
wanted to talk quickly about the Ohio State game coming up on Saturday. I believe they played North Carolina earlier this season. Is that right? In the CBS Sports Classic? Not sure how much of a chance you had to watch them, but
it was the same day as the Kansas game.
Okay.
And I remember we were driving back and I had it on my phone. It was actually a good game. Pete Nance hit a shot to send it to overtime, and then Carolina won in OT. But
I remember that was like Hubert drew up a play out of a timeout, wasn't it? And like threw the ball to Nance, and he had
there was like 0.7 seconds or something too.
Yeah. So this game's, I don't want to call anything a must win, but if Indiana's going to stay in the Big Ten title, they're not really in the race right now because they're 3 games behind Purdue in the loss column. But if they're going to stay in range of maybe being a double bye team in the Big Ten tournament, which is one of the top 4 spots, to me, this feels like a game they really need to win. Ohio State comes in losing 6 of their last 7. They started out really well. And man, if you read some of the stuff that's out there from Ohio State fans on Chris Holtmann, there's definitely a lot of concern just about where he's taking this program. Obviously, they've made the tournament every year he's been there, but it feels like maybe they're not meeting the expectations of what Ohio State's fans think the program should be. Just your thoughts so far on this Ohio State team. To me, it feels like a pretty bad matchup for Ohio State, trying to slow down Trayce Jackson-Davis. They got Zed Key in the paint, but he's not a shot blocker. He's had a knee injury and a shoulder injury, and they just don't come in playing very well. So it should be a pretty good atmosphere, I feel like, at late Saturday night game, national game on Fox, on Assembly Hall. Feels like a game that Indiana needs to win to kind of keep this momentum going and stay within range of Purdue and Rutgers if you're going to make this at least somewhat compelling Big Ten title race.
Yeah, it's a game Indiana needs to win, and it's a game they should win. And I think these are the kinds of games that's going to define their seeding and kind of their NCAA tournament resumes. Like, you can't, okay, Northwestern is pretty good this year, but you can't lose to Northwestern at home and give up 84 points. Like that's unacceptable if you're Indiana. You're a way more talented team. You just can't do that. And this is another game where I look at kind of the same situation. You need to beat Ohio State at home. If you can't do that and beat an 11-9 Ohio State team, a team who has the highest roster turnover from last season to this season in the Big Ten, like, it's just, that can't fly. So it's a game they should win. Rating wise, Ohio State is pretty good. They're 20th in KenPom. They have the 9th best offense in the country, but defensively they're really bad. And they've been really bad on the road this year as well. They've really struggled. And back to Chris Holtmann, there's a lot of criticism. I know a couple of friends of mine kind of think maybe he's not the greatest coach in the world. and you look at kind of the talent they've had under him, it may have kind of carried him a little bit, but this is kind of the first year where you're seeing that maybe this Ohio State team doesn't have the talent that it has in the past. I think Bryce Sensabaugh is one of the best freshmen in the country. That'll be a fun matchup between him and Jalen Hood-Schifino tomorrow night. But that's all going to be figured out on Saturday night. I just think this is a team Indiana should beat with the way they're playing. Both teams are going in basically complete opposite directions. If Indiana doesn't win, there's going to be some problems. And these are the kind of losses that really hurt you, when it comes to March. And I've told this to a couple people, is like that Northwestern loss. I know people, there's still a whole lot of season left to play, but I just have a feeling that's going to hurt them when it comes to Big Ten seeding. That might be the difference between getting a single or a double bye in the Big Ten tournament in Chicago. So it's things like that. It's like these home games are games you have to win.
How impactful do you think it will be if Woodson is? We don't know. We're recording this Friday afternoon. We've not heard anything from Indiana in terms of Woodson being able to coach. I mean, how big of a factor do you think that is ultimately moving forward on a game-to-game basis, having him on the sideline? Do you think it makes a big impact tomorrow if he's not able to coach or not?
I do. I think it does make a big difference. I think we saw in the Minnesota game, there was a lot of confusion on the bench of kind of what to do. Although I think second time around, they might, have a smoother operation. But it probably wouldn't be Coach Rosemond. It would probably either be Brian Walsh or Kenya Hunter who did the game plan or scouting for Ohio State if Mike Woodson doesn't coach. So, but I think you saw it made a difference. I think there were multiple times, on the Big Ten Network broadcast, they would show the bench and there would be a whole lot of confusion of, oh, no subbing, Galloway or Geronimo. Oh, wait, no, go back. It just kind of seemed like a mess. I think with a little more time to prepare, I'm sure they already know whether Mike Woodson is going to be available or not. So I think it might be a little bit better. It also is going to help that they're at home. But I think, and I know I mentioned this early in the podcast, but that timeout at Illinois, I don't know if any other coach would have, I don't know if any of the other three coaches would have made that timeout. 4-0 game, you look at it and say, if it's 4-0, it's 2 minutes into the game, why, that's a bad timeout. But you could just see the shift in energy that Indiana had after that period. And from there, it was all gas, no brakes against the Illini. So it's little things like that Mike Woodson does that I think his experience really shows. He kind of understands when things are getting a little bit too big or things are getting out of hand. And I also think he's been really good with his bench rotations as of late. And that's something a lot of people were critical of in the Minnesota game. So long answer to a question that really only needed a one-word answer is yes. I think it will matter.
Yeah, and you talked about the scouting. Brian Walsh had the Michigan State game, and so Roseman had Minnesota. I assume if they keep it kind of a rolling basis, it would be Kenya Hunter would have Ohio State. I mean, I'm not positive that's how – I would assume that's how it works given the amount of prep that they have to do and the film that they break down. I would assume, though, it just kind of rotates like that. So we'll see. William, thanks again for your time this week on the show. Always fun to talk to you about IU basketball.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
As for Podcast on the Brink, we will be back next week with another episode. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. Leave us a rating on Spotify. And we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.